Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Nykirk, the director of the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement at Northern Kentucky University. We are one of the partners, along with the public libraries in Boone, Kitten, and Campbell County, for the Northern Kentucky Forum. Thanks for being with us this evening. I think we have a very interesting panel, and we hope that you have questions and will engage with our panel as well as we proceed through the night. The forum is still virtual. We are, however, happy to tell you that in February are planning an in-person event, assuming that COVID allows us to do so. It will be something we've done really since the forum's inception, and that is a chance to talk about issues before the Kentucky General Assembly. It will be on President's Day, which is February the 21st, so mark your calendars for that. Again, thanks for being with us, and I'm going to introduce Gail, my colleague at member of the Forum Board and the director of the Kentucky Campus Compact, and Gail will moderate for us this evening. So Gail, thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark, and welcome everyone. We're so glad to have you with us today. Our topic today is refugees in Kentucky, the past, present, and future. And as Mark said, we have a great group of panelists with us today. Dr. Reiko Ozaki is an assistant professor of social work at Northern Kentucky University. She worked with refugees in Central Ohio 20 years ago and continues to be an ally today, engaging university students to become more aware and inclusive. John Koehlinger is the executive director of Kentucky Refugee Ministries in Louisville. During his undergrad years at Northwestern University, John became familiar with Chicago's immigrant and refugee communities. His interest turned into a career and a job in Amman, Jordan, with travels including Egypt, where he encountered many South Sudanese refugees. And his passion for serving refugees continues today in the United States. Mirsada Kadirc is a research manager at COW USA and sits on the boards of RefugeeConnect and the Holocaust and Humanities Center. Being a former refugee from Bosnia, Mirsada wrote her memoir, I Am a Refugee, Finding Home Again in America, as a way to connect with the broader community and bring about understanding and empathy to the plight of refugees who have dominated the news lately. So as you can tell, we're going to have a lot of great conversations today. This evening, this is how it's going to work. Each of our panelists are going to just take 3 to 5 minutes to share their connection with the webinar topic, where it intersects with their life and work. Then Dr. Ozaki is going to talk with us about terminology around this work. Mr. Koehlinger is going to talk about the current events, and Ms. Kadirc is going to talk about her refugee experience. As you've been prompted, you're going to be able to ask questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A section, and then we will be able to address those. Toward the end, we're going to talk about what all of us can do to be allies in this work. So let's get started. Dr. Ozaki, would you please share with us your connection with the webinar topic?
Yes, thank you for having me. Again, my name is Reiko Ozaki, and I'm an assistant professor of social work at NKY. And I'm here as a member of the Northern Kentucky task force that's collaborating to welcome people from Afghanistan right now. And there are other things that connect me to the topic. Like, for example, I'm an immigrant myself. I'm not a refugee. I didn't come here as a refugee, which I will talk about later. But I kind of connect with the refugee people with the experience of being new to another country. And I feel like I can, I share that with people who are refugees. And professionally, I began my career as a social worker in the mid-1990s in Central Ohio, working with some refugees and immigrant people there. And I learned a lot from people, particularly people who are refugees, because my experience was very different from theirs. We had a lot of in common, but we also have a lot that was different. And I learned so much from them. I loved eating with them. I loved learning about their experience in their home country and here in the process. So that was my really love for refugee people. And my career took me to different places over the last 20 years, but I always wanted to be an ally to the refugee community. And so now, as part of my commitment to the refugee community, particularly in Northern Kentucky, I teach social work students about refugees, refugee experience, what the needs of people are, so that as future social workers, they can learn, they can be prepared to serve them with more knowledge. And so not just about learning for them, but also I help them do something for the refugee community, something tangible. So for example, this year, in the spring, earlier this year, my students did an online fundraiser for an agency, RefugeeConnect, which is in Cincinnati, but they are doing a lot of work in Northern Kentucky as well. So that was a great experience for me, my students, and they raised a lot of money that allowed the agency to hire a couple of people. So, and we're planning to do that again, again in the spring. So that's me and my connection to the topic. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ozaki. Next, we'll turn to John Koehlinger. Could you please share with us?
Happy to, Gail. And yeah, it was 2000 that I returned from the Middle East wanting to work with refugees, and got a job here at KRM in Louisville. And since the topic is the past, present, and future of refugees in Kentucky, I can speak to the past during the course of this evening, because I started at KRM in 2000, and KRM was founded in Louisville in 1990. So we're in our 32nd year of resettling refugees in Louisville. And we have over 50 full-time staff, and all the history of resettling refugees from Bosnia and Burma and Sudan and Iraq and so many other countries, some 30 plus other countries. And we opened a sub-office that's in Lexington in 1998, which has grown quite sizable. We have 30 staff there and have resettled over 350 refugees a year there, in kind of during some of our busiest years. And I can also mention there's a long-standing Catholic Charities refugee resettlement agency in Louisville, and a sizable refugee agency in Bowling Green, and a small office in Owensboro. So there is a proud past for refugee resettlements in Kentucky. And the past couple of years, Kentucky, even though refugee admissions have been quite low, Kentucky's ranked as high as 4th this past year in terms of newly arrived refugees admitted through the State Department program being resettled through agencies in our state. So KRM has kind of within the framework of increasing refugee admissions to the U.S., we've received permission from the State Department to open a small office in Northern Kentucky. And so we'll talk more about that. But we're motivated to provide humanitarian protection to vulnerable people who've been persecuted in their country of origin and often in their country of asylum. But we've seen, speaking of the past of refugee resettlement in Kentucky, some tremendous contributions that refugees have made to Kentucky communities, and a very high level of community involvement and engagement that we think has a particularly Kentucky flavor to it, some real authentic hospitality and welcome that's been extended to refugees in different locales around the state. So we're excited to discuss refugee resettlement in Northern Kentucky.
Thank you so much, John. We appreciate it and look forward to hearing more. Mirsada, would you like to share your connection with this work?
Yes, and thank you, Gail, for having me here as well. And as you've already mentioned in the little opening about me, my connection is simple. I am a refugee. I came to this country as a refugee from Bosnia. And so this topic is very personal to me because I've lived through everything that a refugee typically goes through, from leaving their home to trying to find a new home, going through that whole process. And so personally, very passionate about this space. And I was called to act, as John had indicated, in recent years, there has been a little bit of a decline in the US engagement with the refugee population and the acceptance. And so for me, it was really important to, via my own personal story, share with the community why it matters, and that, you may unknowingly have actually refugee neighbors, right, in your own community, and why it's important for us to continue with this resettlement program in the process. And so I wrote my memoir, sharing my story. I've actually shared my story at several local libraries. So thank you for the libraries for organizing this forum. And I'm always seeking opportunities to connect and engage with the community in a productive conversation and in dialogue about this topic, and constructive ways of finding solutions to the refugee problem, which will continue to be of importance in the world, because those numbers just continue to rise year over year. And so thank you for having this opportunity, and I'm happy to engage in the conversation.
Thank you so much. And we look forward to hearing more about your story a little bit later on. First, we thought it would be really good to talk about terminology. Some of you may be like me and do not know a lot about this topic. And so Dr. Ozaki is going to spend a few minutes talking to us about the different words and their meanings and how we can connect with all of those. Dr. Ozaki?
Yes, thank you, Gail. I certainly agree that it is important to have understanding of the terminology that we hear often and be on the same page as we continue the conversation tonight. So I don't think I should just define everything and anything, just because it would be a little bit dry and boring. So I think I'm just going to focus on a couple of very foundational terms. So I'm thinking the term immigrant and refugee and resettlement, and then other terms maybe we'll be able to hear about it and sort of define in the context of the conversation that's going on, that I think might be more helpful than just doing everything at once. So I'm going to start. So this is kind of how I teach my students in my social work courses. So I'm going to start with the term immigrant. So immigrant can be a sort of like an umbrella term. So it is a person, anyone who moves to another country to live there permanently. So, like I said, it's kind of like that umbrella term. And then another way of using this term is to, immigrant sometimes refers to a person who came to the new country by choice. So for example, that's me. Well, actually, I'm both. I am a person who came to the United States to live here permanently, and then I did that by choice. That was my choice. I could have chosen to go to Sweden, for example, or I could have chosen to move to Hong Kong or wherever, and I chose here. So that's the term immigrant. And then that's a little bit different for refugee. So refugee is, refugee can be also considered immigrant when you use the term immigrant as an umbrella term. But also refugee is a very specific term that is about a person who was forced to flee their own country because there is fear, well-founded fear for their safety. So a lot of the times they try to escape from war, some sort of violence. A lot of the times that there's a serious violation of their human rights and lack of public order, a lot of the times based on wars or some political turmoil and persecution that make it really dangerous for them to stay in their own country. And then that often happens because of who they are, like their political affiliation, their ethnic identity, and religious beliefs, things of that nature, and that unfortunately make it difficult for them and dangerous for them to live in their own country. So they have to go so that they can stay safe. So some people, are forced to leave their own country. And so the immigrant who choose to move to another country, they can go back to their own, home country without worrying about being arrested for no reason or being killed, tortured, things of that nature. But for refugees, that's a serious threat that they would face if they decide to go back to their own country. And then refugee people usually take some dangerous path to usually to a neighboring country, like they often leave their own home, and sometimes people walk miles and miles and miles, take a boat, and go to another country and wait and see if they can be in a third country where they can be safe. So that's kind of refugee people. And then so when they are in a neighboring country, and then they wait and live in what we call refugee camp. I think people know that term. And they wait to resettle in the third country. So the third resettlement comes in that sense. So resettlement is a process where refugees are legally admitted by another country, so they could live in that new country. And so refugees do not choose where they go or if they get resettled. That is something that United Nations identify. So the United Nations identifies people who are really in danger, the people who are most vulnerable, and then they refer them to some, various countries. Could be United States, it could be Germany, many other countries. So those are really vulnerable people who are often survivors of violence and people who are at risk, people who need to be protected. So the resettlement process, sometimes people think that people choose the country they want to go to, but that's not the case. For example, I know people who wanted to go to a certain country, but it didn't work for them, so they had to go to another country. So the countries decide who to admit to, and so refugees go through a really rigorous vetting process, and they are reviewed by the United Nations and the new country's government, and they go through layers and layers of security checks, background checks, and interviews. So they go through a lot. So sometimes we hear about people in the United States being afraid of refugees for being criminals and things of that nature. But actually, most people were victims of violent crime themselves rather than being violent, criminals themselves. So I think we have to be aware of these misconceptions that we tend to have in this country. So other things that, so in terms of resettlement, so once they are assigned to resettle in certain countries, then the country decides where people go. So so I think that's when agencies like Kentucky Refugee Ministries come in. So they are the refugee resettlement agency. So they help people to integrate into the new community. So in the case of Kentucky, there are people who are assigned to come into Louisville, Lexington, now Covington, and so agencies get welcoming teams and volunteers and set up apartments and places that they can live, and so the resettlement process kind of begins that way. So that, I think, is like some of the basic terms in a nutshell. So I talked about immigrants, refugee, and resettlement. Those are the three foundational terms that I thought maybe we needed to know. Any questions? Did I miss anything? Did I say anything that was different? Any corrections, John or Mirsada? Gail?
I just add, and
Yeah, go ahead.
it's a common question. Because I know there's a sizable Guatemalan community in northern Kentucky and Covington in particular, and in many Central American and other immigrants seeking to enter the country through our southwestern border, and many are coming for economic opportunity and jobs, which are in doing important work in the Commonwealth and our equine industry, construction, all manner of jobs. Some are fleeing targeted violence or fleeing persecution, and KRM has 6 full-time immigration attorneys, 3 in Louisville, 3 in Lexington, and we represent some of those Central Americans, for example, in seeking asylum, and they have to, it's a high threshold of proof to support their persecution claim on, again, reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, and a minority of people are granted asylum, but so generally KRM works with refugees who are brought in overseas through the State Department program, which Reiko mentioned, and we'll talk about the Afghan evacuees also brought here by our government. But we do support humanitarian welcome for all immigrants of all legal statuses, and we will represent those who in obtaining asylum or applying for asylum if they've been targeted for violence. So.
Great, thank you for that addition. There's no questions in the Q&A. Mirsada, did you have anything else to add at this moment?
No.
Okay. Okay, well, did you say no, Mirsada? Okay. So we can go ahead, John, maybe you could continue and talk with us about the situation with the evacuees from Afghanistan, plus the other refugees that are coming to Kentucky. If you could kind of give us, an update on the current events.
Sure, and kind of both refugee resettlement and resettlement of Afghan evacuees, it's happening, simultaneously right now on a kind of growing scale. But and Mirsada can reference this, but I mean, there is a history here, and a proud history and a bipartisan history of resettling refugees. The kind of modern day refugee program began in the 1980s, and large numbers of refugees, over 100,000 were resettled during the Reagan and Bush senior administrations, and of course in recent years there's been a pretty substantial contraction in the program, but this administration has pledged to grow it, and we've always felt it's representing American principles, support for democracy, and kind of opposition to kind of repression and dictatorship. But in northern Kentucky, there have been some small groups of ethnic Burmese, Chin Burmese, who've relocated in Kenton County, and also some refugees from Somalia who've relocated for some of the job opportunities and a lot of the logistics and distribution warehouses out around greater Cincinnati airport. So we receive small numbers of family members to join Chin Burmese and Somalis who are now green card holders or US citizens, and their family members are being resettled here as refugees. So that's been historically our kind of small involvement in northern Kentucky, but like going forward, we may get refugees from everyone who's resettled through the refugee program. There's some concern about resettling too many in one city, like in Louisville, we've resettled as many as 740. But refugee resettlement involves, as Reiko alluded to, finding housing, furniture, household items, donations. Refugees receive medical care upon arrival, as well as prior to their departure. We're enrolling children in schools, and I can tell you upwards of 40% of the Afghan evacuees in the safe havens and military bases are children. So it's something for a public school system to have the English as a second language services to work with refugee students, as well as engage their parents. There's some initial we help refugees get social security cards, register for public benefits, WIC, food stamps. Our program brings a lot of federal financial support for refugees for the first 8 months. I mean, not a lot in absolute terms. It's sort of bare bones actually, but enough to support refugees early on, while we provide case management and access to medical care and English language classes and cultural orientation. But the general orientation of the refugee resettlement program is to move refugees to self-sufficiency, to place them in full-time employment within 6 months after their arrival, to have them within their first year become self-supporting, not dependent on public benefits or on agency support, although we're there if needed. And Mirsada can comment on this, and I certainly can. We've had such robust, such amazing success with refugees finding initial employment all over Kentucky, entry-level jobs, working their way up, working in a lot of critical industries, from truck drivers to, we all buy things from Amazon. You have so many refugees working at these Amazon distribution warehouses or UPS. We have so many refugees working in healthcare, working with St. Elizabeth Healthcare up in northern Kentucky. They have a great diversity and equity and inclusion program. They employ many refugees and immigrants in everything from environmental services to sort of patient care positions, food service. Refugees, they've gained their purchase and acceptance in Kentucky through working hard, strong work ethic, and in so many industries. And we all hear about the workforce development needs and the tight, shortage of workers, and so refugees, are there to take, to fill important jobs, and we're excited about Northern Kentucky, and where has the most dynamic economic growth, the greatest job creation in our state, and how refugees can contribute to that. We're also working very closely with school districts and providing school support and out-of-school time programming and helping parents engage, because we're very excited about some of the achievements we've seen of refugee students in our community colleges, in our four-year colleges. And Reiko can speak to the presence of refugee students at Gateway Community College, or NKU, and NKU has been a good partner for us in this task force for welcoming Afghan refugees. And then it's, our attorneys help, immigration attorneys help refugees, obtain their green cards, permanent residence, bring family members who they may have been separated with. We have citizenship classes, and help them become new Americans, naturalized U.S. citizens 5 years after arrival, and to participate, civically and otherwise in our community. So that's what we're on track for, kind of through the summer, going into this new fiscal year, which for us on the federal, we're kind of running on a federal calendar, begins in October. So we were looking for 680 refugees for KRM to resettle in Louisville, 450 in Lexington, and then 100 in Northern Kentucky, through an office in Covington, but those 100 may have been resettled in Boone County to join family members there, just in Northern Kentucky in general, with our focus on Covington. Well, then, we had the Afghan, crisis, the collapse of Afghanistan, and the evacuation, extraordinary evacuation of, the numbers change, and so, but it's clearly over 70,000. Probably maybe there's still some Afghans overseas, and some U.S. Military bases, and some transit hubs that will be transported stateside for resettlement. But so far, 25,000 refugees, Afghan evacuees, have been resettled through resettlement agencies nationally. Just here in Louisville, we've gotten really in the past 3 to 4 weeks, very kind of accelerated numbers. We now have 81 on the ground. They kindly booked 23 refugees to arrive Thanksgiving week here in Louisville. So like our staff were kind of working 7 days a week. The arrivals come very short notice, kind of on Saturdays and and weekends. And as Reiko mentioned, so we're not getting as much lead time, so there's a lot of renting of housing and getting the furniture, and kind of scrambling when we get a notice that an Afghan family of 4 or 5 or 9, or a group of single Afghan humanitarian evacuees are coming to our site. So for the Afghan evacuees, we've pledged to resettle 250, and it's given that there's so many on the bases, and there's so many logistical and support needs that go into resettling a family. It does appear that the resettlement will extend certainly into the first quarter of 2022. But I mentioned 250 through KRM in Louisville, 125 in Lexington, and then 50 in Covington, KRM Covington, we just got into the system, the State Department system. Last week, they immediately allocated 30 Afghan cases to us, comprising 56 individuals, many individuals, some larger families. So that is coming up in sort of the December through February timeframe for Northern Kentucky for us to place those families. And I'm sorry we don't have an Afghan refugee to speak, to the forum. And I can say it's a very real threat that they were under, and many of them have family members who are facing reprisals from the Taliban, because they had family members who supported the U.S. mission, working directly for the U.S. military or for some U.S. government agency in Afghanistan. So there's a real visceral, real fear, real desperation on the part of our Afghans here about getting their family members out and hoping that they can be resettled. So I can say from what we've seen so far, there's a diversity, there's a diversity in Afghan of, ethnic groups and people backgrounds, but also, we're seeing, some large families with limited English, and we're seeing certainly significant numbers of people who have graduate degrees, MBAs, computer, networking degrees, project managers, engineers, as well as interpreters who interpreted for the U.S. military in combat situations. Some people who work for the embassy, very high level skills, high levels of English, who've been working in U.S. environments for U.S. government-run organizations or the military itself for a number of years, who sacrificed a lot and are just devastated by what their families are subject to still in Afghanistan because of their service to the U.S. So, but we think, so there's a lot of distress, and the children have been on the base, mind you. This evacuation ended at, I think, August 26th. So here we are, November 18th, and they've been on the bases for, several months now, living in tents. It's getting colder, and there's been good support there, and they've received some medical care, and have applied for employment authorization, Social Security, and some very stringent security screenings even before they entered the U.S. overseas. And since the U.S. was in Afghanistan for 20 years, there's very significant biometric, database for that the U.S. has built up over 2 decades for that biometric screening. But we feel it's going to be a whole range of families really needing support to adjust and welcome to adjust to life in Kentucky, and also some outstanding high caliber professionals, all proven credentials, who we think can contribute a lot to businesses in Northern Kentucky, Louisville, and Lexington. So
Thank you so much, John. It's so interesting to hear all of this. I've learned a lot already. And now I know we're going to turn to Mirsada, who has a personal experience with this. And I know everybody's interested in hearing about that. So Mirsada, would you mind sharing your story with us?
Yes, absolutely. First thing I always like to start with is just to kind of set the context, just like Dr. Ozaki did. And I will kind of refer to some of the words and things that she, as well as John, have said. And one of the things that she said, you're forced to flee. That is fundamentally true for every refugee that you will encounter, is that it was not a choice. You had to leave your home, and it was a life or death decision. And so the other thing that I always like to start with in terms of context is that literally your life changes almost overnight and is turned completely upside down and completely out of your control. And I think, you know, we all saw that happening in Afghanistan, right? We went from things were fine on the ground to people hanging on to airplanes and trying to flee in a matter of just days, right? And so for me, my story starts on a very fateful Sunday afternoon back in 1992, when I was just 10 years old. We had our typical Sunday afternoon family meal. And it was with my grandparents, my mom and my dad. And suddenly we were startled by a large truck coming to an abrupt stop right in front of our house. 50 heavily armed men in army uniforms surrounded our house and screamed to get out with our hands in the air. And that was the day they took my dad to a concentration camp. And the last time I ever saw him. A week later, they came and took all of our possessions. And a week after that, my mom and I were taken to a different concentration camp while they bombed our home to the ground. And mind you, this was back in Bosnia, right? It used to be part of Yugoslavia. And so I don't know if you followed the news and the things that were happening, but it was civil war, right? We had neighbors turning on neighbors. And so my father was literally murdered by former colleagues and friends, so-called, right? But because the propaganda and the fear was so strong in the country at that time, you literally had people turning on one another just simply based on fear. And that's why fear is such a strong motivator for a lot of people, right? It's the strongest emotion we can feel. Now, my mom and I were lucky enough in that we would eventually be released from the concentration camp that we were in. But as Dr. Ozaki was talking about, walking on foot, we were released into a forest, not even knowing where we were, and just ran for survival, because when they released us, they just started shooting after us. And so we ran and eventually ended up getting to an outskirt of a town, recognized that it was, so to speak, a safe zone for us at that time. And there were already makeshift refugee camps set up for those who were fleeing other areas that were already under siege. And we were also further lucky in that we had family living outside of Bosnia at that time. Just like today, it's very normal for Europeans to be from one country but work in another and constantly switching borders. And so my father's 3 brothers were actually all working outside of Bosnia at that time. And so they somehow messaged us via telegraphs and things like that at that time. Radio amateurs were connecting the lines because telephone lines are down and there's no communication going in and out, and basically instructed us to take a taxi and get out of the country. And so literally taxi drivers, that's how they were making money that during that time, is getting people out of the country through woods and makeshift paths. And so we crossed the border with no documentation and nothing on us, but just trying to get out of that situation and get out alive. And once we escaped, that is when we were seeking asylum, first in Switzerland, and then later on, sorry, I messed that up. First in Slovenia and then later on in Switzerland, because none of these places were taking us in permanently. It was very temporary basis. And as Dr. Ozaki was talking about, you go through a very rigorous process. And we had some family who had already been assigned to the United States, and at that time in the 90s, United States and actually Australia were one of the few who were still taking Bosnian refugees in on a permanent basis, right? And so we went through that rigorous process, and actually refugee immigrant status is the most scrutinized immigration status we have in the United States. The process is designed to last on average 2 years. I know the Afghan evacuation situation is a little different, But for the most part, refugees that we see typically come through the program these days are on average waiting 17 years to be processed, because there's such a backlog and such a need for refugee resettlement globally. And so for us, it was roughly about 2 years of that process and getting through the interviews and the screening and the psych evaluations, et cetera. And eventually we were told, you will be going to the United States, to Cincinnati. Actually, we were resettled through Catholic Charities of Southwest Ohio, but ended up being put on this Northern Kentucky side of things. And I think it's primarily, to John's point, because of housing and the employment opportunity that my mother would have in Northern Kentucky. And as any immigrant, as Dr. Ozaki said, I think one thing that's true for all of us who never were to the United States before coming here, the only image you have of America is that of TV shows and movies. And I was no different. And so my expectations and picture of America was Beverly Hills 90210, because that was the show that I loved back being a teenager in the 90s. And so you can only imagine the shock that you experience when you actually get here. I came to Boone County High School, right? And nothing against Boone County High School, but it's not Beverly Hills, Beverly Hills High School. And it is a very tough adjustment at first. And for me in particular, it was very tough because, you know, I was put into ESL class at first for my first 6 months being here, not speaking the language. And there was 8 of us total in that class, and none of us from the same country. And so I spent a lot of my time all alone, eating lunch all alone in the school cafeteria, being bullied, made fun of. And it's a very, very lonely experience. I'm happy to report that at least today at Boone County High School alone, there's over 100 non-English speaking students there. And so they almost have a community of their own now, right? And can rely on each other to survive those awful high school days. And I would eventually end up at NKU, where my sophomore year, and NKU is very near and dear to my heart because I have met some wonderful professors like Dr. Ozaki. Mentor who I have is Dr. Levin, who has been a lifelong mentor to me. But at NKU, I experienced what I call a moment of breakthrough, because I happened to sit next to a student who was working for the college newspaper, The Northerner. And at that time, it was still printed, but he heard my story and he was so intrigued by it that he wanted to do a front page article, Bosnian refugee finds peace on campus. And so I agreed, and it happened, and my face was plastered all over campus. But that allowed the students to actually become a bit more curious about me and want to know me. And I finally, my sophomore year of college, so 4 years into my time of being here, made some American friends and finally felt like I was actually part of this community. And so my, so to speak, American dream just kind of took off from there. I was very fortunate in that I got some great mentoring and guidance along the way to get me into a very solid career that I'm still in to this day in market research. And, you know, I became a United States citizen, to John's point, 5 years into us arriving here. So we came here late 98. So 2004, I became a US citizen. And so for me, you know, that refugee title that I was carrying with me for so long was now a thing of the past, right? And I went on the next 10 years living in this American bubble of mine where I was very comfortable, right? I had made it, so to speak. I had a job, an apartment of my all on my own, traveling all over the world. And then, you know, leading up to the 2016 election, there was a lot of discussion around refugees, right? And who they are and what they are and what threat they are to this country, which touched me really deeply personally. And I felt I needed to do something. And so I'm typically an introvert. I've gotten more comfortable speaking to folks in forums like this, but my writing became an outlet for me. And so I started writing poetry in moments that were very difficult, and then eventually ended up writing my story and becoming a bit more comfortable speaking in front of groups and connecting with people I don't know, to bring more awareness to this topic, to the fact that, as John mentioned, we have a very healthy and long history in refugee resettlement in this state that I hope only will continue. And I will say it's been a wonderful, call it 5 years or so being involved in the local nonprofit community. I first started volunteering with RefugeeConnect, where I still sit on the board of that organization, and then eventually got myself involved with the local Holocaust and Humanities Center and sit on that board. And my story is actually featured in their humanity gallery. And so it's been really wonderful to have opportunities like this to connect with the community and share human stories, real stories of people that are in our community who have gone through horrendous things, but they made the most of it. John was talking about making sure that refugees are self-sufficient as quickly as possible and integrated into this community. For us, that meant my mother was employed within 3 months of us arriving here. We were no longer technically receiving assistance. And, we have, I would say, my mother, first of all, has never missed a day of work. She still works in a factory environment. I think that is one thing that is probably very common for the immigrant experience, is that hardworking mentality and being so thankful to just have an opportunity. I always say, being a refugee, you're just thankful to have a home without the fear for your life. You're literally willing to do anything and all to contribute to your new community, because you actually know what it's like to lose it all. And so I will say any refugee you come across will be probably one of the most hardest working, most grateful people you will ever meet in your life.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. What an incredible life experience. Thank you. It's very meaningful that you shared that. Mirsada, there was a question for you, since we're going into the question Q&A time. And so others of you, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A section down below on your screen. We'll start with you, Mirsada, and then John, we have one for you too. Mirsada, since you work with a lot of younger refugees in the area, do you feel like it has improved significantly in the area for them? I know you mentioned that Boone County High School has 100 non-native English speakers, but do you feel like they have a good community with each other, even if they are refugees from different nations?
Yes, I'm happy to report that things have gotten better. And in fact, just thinking about RefugeeConnect, the organization that I'm personally involved with and started my nonprofit work with, didn't exist when I first came here, right? So RefugeeConnect was established as an idea of the Junior League of Cincinnati back in 2013 and became its own nonprofit only 3 years ago, 2018. So, and there are more and more organizations like this, right, that have recognized this is a need in our community, that this community of non-English speakers and immigrants exists, and that we need to welcome them and make sure that they're fully integrated and truly part of our community. And so, for example, RefugeeConnect now is directly involved with Boone County schools and making sure that the programming, because one of the key differentiators for our programming is that we are so centered on the kids who are in the school systems, because the future is in their hands, right? Most of the time, again, the parents, the goal there is that they become fully employed and they're immediately contributing kind of to support their own families. Kids are the ones that need the most guidance, because a lot of times they're just left up to their own, not even getting much help or support from the parents, because even English is a barrier, right? And so, yes, the support has gotten better. They definitely, the kids themselves too, feel like they have more of a sense of a community, and there are programming and things in place to help them cope with the trauma that they themselves have experienced and the PTSD that's associated in being a child refugee, and sharing stories and other formats that, yes, in short, it has gotten better. So from a support and the agencies and the various community organizations that exist, I will say it has gotten better. What worries me is honestly the broader community and the acceptance and the welcoming of refugees or those who are not like us, right? That's what worries me more. And I hope forums like this are just the beginning of hopefully changing that dynamic in our communities and making sure that folks are really understanding and hopefully open their hearts and minds to welcoming refugees into our community.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. I think this is for you, John. You had started talking a little bit about asylum, and I'm wondering if you could, this question was, could you elaborate a bit on what granting asylum provides to a refugee?
Yes, if someone seeks asylum here and is granted asylum, they cannot be removed or deported or sent back to the country from which they fled, because it's been accepted that they could face harm, they could be killed if they are returned to their country of origin. And that's the same principle for refugees. Mirsada referenced kind of an average of 17 years where refugees are in limbo, a country of asylum, and there's usually State Department, United Nations waiting. Can they be ever repatriated, ever sent back to their home country? And at some point, it's determined, no, it's not likely. So they're resettled on a permanent basis. Any refugees, admitted through the State Department program, they're here. They have to apply for, like people granted asylum. They need to apply for their green card permanent residence after 1 year, and then to become naturalized citizens after 5 years if they choose. I will note that this is because the evacuation of the Afghans was so abrupt and urgent. They were admitted to the U.S. as humanitarian, under humanitarian parole, which is a temporary 2-year status. So unlike refugees or people who are granted asylum, these Afghan evacuees legally, they have to apply for asylum to remain here in the U.S. beyond 2 years. So that's a point of some debate. How are 70,000 people going to be, secure legal representation to apply for asylum, which is a very kind of long and arduous, and again, a very high threshold, a lot of legal research going on to prove persecution. So we're hopeful that Congress will provide like an Afghan Adjustment Act that will allow Afghans to stay beyond their parole period.
There's I think a follow-up to that, John, or maybe to the other panelists, but do the Afghan refugees get financial assistance from the government when they arrive? And if so, for how long is that assistance available?
And at first, it seems like they weren't going to get that assistance, and the State Department came up with a kind of a quick refugee look-alike program for basic needs support for 90 days. And we were saying, well, that's not going to be sufficient. And then Congress, with passed legislation kind of at the end of the year related to the continuing resolution on the budget, there was a rider that provided Afghans with eligibility for similar benefits through our program that refugees are eligible for. So there's that financial support generally lasts 8 months. And again, it's hoped that they can be employed at that time, but prior to that, and then support after that could come from private, sources if needed.
Great, thank you. Dr. Ozaki, there was a question about this resettlement, about refugees going to a separate country, a second country, but then being settled in a third country. Do they ever stay in the second country? And how does the United Nations get connected with where to send them? How do they get connected?
So I think actually something that people don't realize is that most people don't ever get resettled into a new country. A lot of people remain what is called stateless, or they don't have a citizenship anywhere. So a lot of the people who fled their home country and go to run through the jungle and go to the neighboring country, a lot of the times they end up there. And so I've also heard about people who are, let's say, lived in a refugee camp for many years, and then they end up sort of adapt to the region, and then live in an apartment nearby. So they kind of end up living there, but that doesn't mean they are legally admitted into the country. So they are still in limbo. But unfortunately, there are millions of people like that all over the world who are kind of living somewhere, but not really their country, in any way. And they are still in fear of going back to their home country, and they are not being accepted into another, country as a refugee. So unfortunately, that I think is one of the most common scenarios.
If I could I speak to that? Because
Sure.
it's such a good question. There's so many examples. Like many of the Chin Burmese in Kenton County, brutal. We saw the military coup, and that vicious kind of military government in Burma has kind of ethnically cleansed and attacked so many kind of ethnic areas of Burma. Those Chin Burmese were in Malaysia and Kuala Lumpur, and I know they were harshly treated there, and it was illegal for them to even operate schools like in the apartments. They weren't allowed, their children weren't allowed to attend schools in Malaysia. And we had a group, and I'm from Cincinnati, I want to add, grew up there, and very familiar with Northern Kentucky. But in Kentucky and in Cincinnati, we had a group of nationwide, a group of, they're referred to as Bhutanese refugees that have been quite successful. They're actually ethnic Nepalis who, 100 years ago, their grandfathers and, kind of farmers and great-grandfathers migrated over to Bhutan, but because they were ethnically different than the Bhutanese, they were kind of brutally expelled back into Nepal. And even though they had the same language and ethnicity, they're ethnic Nepalis, they were confined for close to 20 years in refugee camps in Nepal, and were not able to integrate. And we also have Somali refugees in Northern Kentucky, and we have some coming to through KRM who are currently in South Africa, and I know they've faced horrible discrimination and violence in South Africa. And the last example I wanted to cite, and Mirsada, I'm sure, could speak to this. When I first started working at KRM, we had received, we were settling some Bosnian refugees who had initially been evacuated to Germany, where they had very generous benefits and housing, but they weren't able to work. and they weren't granted permanent residence or citizenship in Germany. And even there, some of them were grumbling that the benefits from the U.S. refugee program were kind of paled in significance to the support that they received in Germany. But the critical difference being, and Mirsada mentioned her mom having to go to work in 3 months in this sort of early self-sufficiency track. But long term, I think we can be proud that refugees that the U.S. admitted do become Americans, do become naturalized U.S. citizens. Their children do, they are achieving, very, wonderful things. You wouldn't even know they came here as refugees. And I think that's our way in the United States, as opposed to putting people in, enclaves and providing government assistance, but not allowing them to integrate into our communities.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, John, that was exactly the same thing that happened to us in Switzerland, right? And maybe even better benefits than Germany, but no work permits, no permanent status. We had kind of a 5-year limited approval to stay, and then we were supposed to go back. I'm not sure where or what to, but that is when we had applied through the UN and to go through that process to arrive in the United States. And then I don't think John has spoken to this, but to the point about the US system and how it differs, and that self-sufficiency is really the goal within the first year of arrival. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, for most, that is government assistance ends after 9 months of being here. And most are employed within the first 6 months of arriving. And we also have to pay back the transportation costs that were actually part of our resettlement over time back to the government.
Yeah, a little known but shocking fact to me. I mean, you have a Congolese family of 6 or 7, and then they're not discounted tickets. They owe $8,000 on their travel loan from the moment they arrive in Louisville or Greater Cincinnati Airport.
There's
And please don't get me wrong, this is not about griping about the US government not being generous. It is just to level set the conversations or the things that may be happening outside of this virtual wall of, them being a drain on our system, right? Or receiving all of this assistance that goes, so to speak, unrepaid back. And that is certainly not the case.
I think that's one of the biggest things that my students are surprised about, that people have to repay the airfare, something that people don't think about.
Mm-hmm. There's another question. With the current housing crisis, how challenging has it been to find housing for refugees, families in the area? I don't know who wants to take that.
Yeah, no, that is, it's a nationwide, shortage of affordable housing. I think Kentucky's become a kind of preferred site for refugee resettlement because of our reasonable cost of living, including housing. Unfortunately, we're receiving many refugees who were settled in other states, California, Chicago, really all over, who are a year later, they've heard from refugees, hey, their job availability is good. This is our rent. We have this community here. And so people are coming here for jobs, for lower rents. But it is a tight rental market for all kind of low to moderate income Americans. And I think Northern Kentucky will be challenging in that respect. Finding affordable housing, but just so people know, we're paying market rents, market rate rents for refugee housing. There's no special card we waive that obligates a landlord to make an apartment or a single family home available to us. So it is a challenge, but I think refugees are very like family oriented, like no incidents of crime, good tenants. A lot of them stay in the initial apartments until they've saved money to buy a home through, working, multiple family members working jobs, taking all available overtime. So once we do sort of persuade property owners that, it's not a risk, that our program and also refugees employment income will support their housing costs, they often are quick to give us more apartments. It's just kind of explaining the program. It's a little complicated sometimes.
Thank you. We have a question, a couple of the same question. If someone lives in Northern Kentucky and wants to help, what can we do?
I think I can say something here. This is something John can speak more, but I think I would love for everybody to do what I just did last night. I signed up to be a volunteer for KRM. So there's you can go to KRM website and there is a volunteer page, and it was pretty easy to sign up to be a volunteer. There are information sessions, there are orientation sessions, and you have to go through background check. But I think there's a lot that we can do as community members.
And I will add, before we let John finish with all of the ways we can help, but to the point about volunteering, and selfishly, the organization that I help support, RefugeeConnect, also accepts volunteers. As I'm sure many of you know, nonprofit world it's always a tough environment. So monetary donations are always helpful and will go a long way. RefugeeConnect has a community navigator program where we actually hire refugees to help connect the other refugees and get them to the resources that they need, even after that initial resettlement that John and his team help manage. And so volunteering is definitely one way, and monetary donations. And I will say, continue to engage in conversations, and whether it's with your family members, friends, colleagues, wherever you have the opportunity, I think, to even call out things that you may hear that are not accurate or true, or to challenge folks when something is misspoken, or just to bring more awareness to this, just even sharing what you attended tonight, or the resources that you heard about tonight. The more we spread the word about this effort and what this all means, the better for all of us as a community.
Yeah. And I'm going to strike a broader note, kind of following on Mirsada's comments, not talk about donations and furniture and money and volunteering. I'm going to speak to, everyone in the community, because refugees, they touch, they go through the same systems that we all go through. Like, you may be a medical service provider and you may be providing medical care to refugees. You may be an educator and you may have some Afghan or Congolese students in your class who are struggling, and kind of referencing, Mirsada's initial experience. People need some, sort of welcome and encouragement. And you may be an employer, and like many employers, you're frustrated and struggling because you're having difficulty finding employees for your enterprise. And it takes some, I'm not going to say accommodation, but flexibility, and working with KRM, and we have some refugees who need jobs and need a first start here in the U.S. to support themselves, and they may not be fluent in English, and they may be different from the other employees at your company, but they'll have a strong work ethic, and they can bring real value and loyalty. I like kind of Mirsada kind of touched on, her mother, like working in the same, job all these years, and kind of, refugees do bring diversity in culture, but they're highly focused on some things that we are all focused on, and that's education, achievement, family well-being, safety, acceptance, participation in community and civic life. So if you can take that first step of welcome, I think it can lead to a lot of positive things for our community and for those families, those students, or those patients in your medical clinic, or those employees in your company.
Thank you, John. I love that. We really do try to promote at NKU civic engagement. And so that's what you're talking about, is really noticing who's in your community and having hospitality. There is a follow-up to the kind of what we can do. If someone signs up to be a volunteer, what kind of things do volunteers do?
I can say right now, like we're getting very short notice on the travel bookings for Afghans off the military bases. So like this, collecting furniture and household items in advance and assisting in kind of setting up homes, that's been so helpful for us. I mean, we've had 81. We haven't had a single Afghan or refugee. We've had like 40 refugees during the month of November. Also, nobody's staying in a hotel or temporary housing like in a lot of sites. We've been able to get everybody situated in permanent housing. And then down the line, there's some needs for clothing and community orientation, and maybe some assistance with some appointments and things, but generally our staff handle like all the necessary appointments. But it's a range of things. We have a lot of people pre-pandemic who were involved in tutoring refugee students. Of course, there's been with COVID precautions, that's been reduced considerably, but there's some opportunities. And
Thank you. Does anybody else want to answer that about what volunteers do, or is that sufficient for this time?
I think it is.
Yeah, I can add something. So I think creativity and flexibility are something that can be really helpful. There will be, some opportunities that happens based on some events that's happening in the community. For example, there was a time that I went to a refugee day at the Capitol a couple of years ago, and I went with a staff person at the time from Kentucky Refugee Ministry to Frankfurt. We drove a van over there, and there are other people from the community who, were volunteers there to add the voice to advocating for refugee people at the Capitol. So there are a lot of different things that is possible. So I think, our ability to be open and be flexible will be really helpful. Working for, volunteering for, Kentucky Refugee Ministries or RefugeeConnect. I think either way, there's a lot of interesting and great opportunities.
Thank you so much.
Great point about the events, Dr. Ozaki. That is one of the things that we certainly as an organization miss so much from the past. Since COVID, we haven't been able to hold any events. But I will again do a shameless plug, and hopefully we will not have to cancel it again. But World Refugee Day is always in June. John, correct me if I'm wrong, June 22nd?
June 20th, yes, June 20th.
20th. I was close. And in honor of that day, the reason why I wasn't exact on the date is because we always organize a World Refugee Day Cup. Soccer tends to be a world language, so to speak. Everybody can understand a good game of soccer, regardless of where you're from, what you speak. And so we would literally host a whole day tournament style soccer tournament that involves food from other places and local resources and community building and whatnot. And so we usually pick a day that's close or around, but still on a weekend to celebrate World Refugee Day as kind of like one of our biggest events, and more to find about that on our website. And hopefully 22 will be the year when we bring it back.
Great. We have just two last questions, and then I'll turn it back to Mark. But someone, Mirsada, had a request. They found your Northern article, and they were asking about the quote at the end. The article mentioned that it sounded pretty in your native language, and that it translated to, "I can because I want to." Is that something you could say in your native language and then maybe mention it?
Yes. So in my native language, it's "Ya mogu jer hoću." And literally translated, it's "I can because I want to." And it's something that my mother has said to me over and over again. And I get a lot of strength from my mother, and thanks to her, we survived the ordeal that we went through and her resourcefulness. But she's the one that always kept going because I can, right? It's that can-do attitude, I guess, is the best way maybe to translate that saying.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Our last question is, are there currently any refugees being settled in Campbell County?
There are not, mostly Boone and Kenton County, but coincidentally, I did get a contact from U.S. government personnel in Alexandria in Campbell County who worked with some Afghans in Kabul in an official capacity, and they're on the military bases. So he was asking, can we get them routed to Campbell County, where his family is,
Thank you. That's a great story. So I want to just give each panelist 30 seconds if you would like to say something at the end here, and just something that you want us to remember. We really only have about 30 seconds to a minute for each of you, but I just want to thank all of you so much for being here. You've opened my eyes to a lot of things and really shared such an important topic. Dr. Ozaki, do you want to start first? Just 30 seconds, what you might want people to remember from tonight?
Sure. I think it's the importance of hearing the stories. I really appreciated hearing Mirsada's story, and I would love to read your book. And I want to tell you that one of the things that I learned the most about 20 some years ago when I first started working with the Cambodian people was reading the self-published book about the Cambodian refugee experience that really, really helped me understand what it's like, not just about, reading something, but just reading, a book about somebody's life experience. So I think it's really helpful for anyone who wants to understand, to learn directly from the people who went through it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. John, do you have a couple words for us?
Yeah, I'll just touch on a theme Mirsada spoke to, and that's kind of loyalty, and I want to say, I could even say gratitude, for refugees, to communities that welcome them, and they give back so much to those communities, and you know, despite cultural differences, they're really wanting the same things we as Americans want, and they're very loyal to those things that we believe in.
Thank you. Mirsada, you get to be our last word tonight.
Thank you, Gail. And I will end on hopefully an inspirational note. And I always mention this fact when I speak, that refugees have always been a part of the American society at the highest levels. So Albert Einstein, Nikola Tesla, and even Google's co-founder, Sergey Brin, were all once refugees here. And that alone, I think, should be a lesson for us, that you can never underestimate the potential of any one human being on this planet. And so my message, and actually there is a refugee lady that says it way better than I do in a TED Talk. Her name is Luma Mufle. And her TED Talk is about, don't feel sorry for refugees, believe in them. And I encourage all of you to watch it and listen to it. And it's about that belief in the refugees and just giving them a chance, give them an opportunity. And like John said, they will give you back tenfold, if not more. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirsada, and thank you to all the panelists. We just really appreciated your participation tonight. Mark, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you, panelists. I almost hate to say anything because it would be great just to walk away with Mirsada with your beautiful words. And John and Reiko, thanks so much for being with us and the context that you gave us for understanding this issue. Mirsada, I honestly, I think all the audience, we're not all together, so we can't applaud, but I think I can speak for the audience in saying how beautiful and important your story was to hear. Thank you very much for sharing it and for being with us and for reminding us of the importance of being a welcoming nation and the contributions that you and your fellow refugees have made to making America a little more America. Everybody, please, we're going to mark your calendars December 1st. We will be having a morning Zoom, a cafe, so grab a cup of coffee and be with us. Remind you that even if you have to drive to work, you can Bluetooth your phone right to your radio and listen in. But on the 1st for an hour, beginning at 8:30, we will have Dennis Keene, who is, of course, from Northern Kentucky and is the current Commissioner of Local Government in the state government. So we'll hear about what that job is all about and how we, as a community, can connect to the resources through that office. So be with us, if you will, on December 1st. And you can register for that now at nkyforum.org. Our forum on the 21st of February, the legislative forum, is not up for an RSVP site yet. We're pinning down the final details on that. It will be an evening forum in person at the Kenton County building. That's the old brewery there that you see from I-75 at 12th Street in Covington. There's a community room there, and so we'll be in that room. And we have a couple more forums in the works that will announce soon. So you can always see what's up at nkyforum.org and follow us on Facebook. And thanks for being with us this evening. And we will see you in the morning on December the 1st. And everybody have a wonderful Thanksgiving. It's not so far away. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. You did a great job.
Thank you, Gail. And thank you, Mark. Really appreciate the invitation and opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I learned so much tonight, and so I'm really grateful, and I'm going to see how to get involved.
Yeah,